this morning, the trade war is now impacting tomatoes. A new policy kicks in today, making way for a 21% price hike on tomato imports. This does come after the Trump administration ended a decades-old trade agreement with Mexico.
Mexico, meant to protect U.S. farmers, is pushing up prices for buyers who are already struggling with the high cost of living. The Consumer Price Index shows beef prices are up 10%, egg prices up 25%, and coffee prices up 13%. And now President Trump is tacking on a 17% duty on Mexican tomatoes, meant to protect American growers who only contribute about 30% to the U.S. supply.
The administration has also announced new tariffs that could raise the price of tomatoes at the grocery store.
When Canada's Customs Bulletin announced a dumping determination against imported fresh tomatoes, U.S. growers heard more than legal language. They heard a warning.
They're going up. It's ridiculous. People can't even go in and buy vegetables.
Simultaneously, the Office of the United States Trade Representative flagged tomato imports as an emerging trade barrier, hinting at wider disruptions. Fields in California and Florida, once assured of export markets, suddenly lost direction as screening intensified and access shifted.
And the Trump administration says this move will drive down prices, but opponents say will increase what people pay at the grocery store. However, California isn't reliant on tomatoes from other countries. Mexico supplies about 70% of the tomato market in the U.S., with some 4 billion pounds of tomatoes each year.
Families whose livelihoods depended on cross-border shipments realized their world was changing. At the same moment, industry watchers detected something else. Mexico ramping up with speed, responding to every gap left in America's wake.
University of Arizona has estimated that tomatoes will rise 38 to 70% in cost at the retail level.
This story isn't just about tomatoes. It's about leadership, opportunity, and the balance of agricultural power shifting at breakneck pace. It started with an announcement buried in legal jargon. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency cited pesticide residues and quality concerns, the kind of dry phrasing most people ignore. But behind those words was a decision that would hit like an earthquake. Overnight, Canada shut its doors to American tomatoes, cutting off a $340 million trade stream that thousands of families depended on. Officially, it was about safety. Unofficially, reports suggest it was about strategy, a calculated move to shift power in North America's agricultural market. Within 48 hours, chaos replaced routine. At the Peace Bridge, 150 truckloads of California-grown tomatoes were refused entry. Another 89 shipments froze in limbo at the Ambassador Bridge. Refrigeration units hummed, trying to preserve what couldn't be saved. Every minute meant more loss, and every mile of backed up traffic told a story of promises broken. For the farmers, it wasn't just produce rotting, it was trust. The timing made it sting even more. Just weeks before, Canada had finalized $180 million in contracts with domestic greenhouse growers in British Columbia and Ontario. New facilities, fully funded and fast-tracked, were built to replace the exact volume once imported from the US. Analysts believed the quality excuse was a smokescreen. Canada wasn't reacting, it was planning, and that plan didn't include American farmers. By the time most people heard about the ban, the damage was already irreversible. Trade routes were paralyzed. Communities that depended on cross-border shipments were suddenly cut off. Families who had borrowed against future harvests now faced the unthinkable. Fields full of crops and nowhere to send them. But while America's farmers were left waiting for answers, another country was already moving to claim the opportunity they'd lost. Mexico's $12 billion takeover. While American farmers scrambled for relief, Mexico was already rewriting the playbook. What began as a quiet response to Canada's ban exploded into a full-scale transformation, one that would pull billions across the border and flip the balance of agricultural power. Reports suggest that within weeks of the US fallout, European investors saw the opening and pounced. They weren't just funding farms, they were building a new empire. In the sun-baked regions of Sinaloa, Sonora, and Baja California, construction crews worked around the clock. Glass greenhouses rose from the desert like cities of light. These weren't the dusty fields of old. They were climate controlled, sensor driven, and powered by data. Automated systems adjusted water, nutrients, and temperature in real time. The result? Year-round production using nearly 40% less water than traditional American farms. Efficiency wasn't a dream anymore. It was Mexico's new reality. European agribusiness giants poured in more than $12 billion, and the impact was immediate. $7 billion went straight into advanced hydroponic systems, ensuring consistent yields even during droughts. $3 billion more built the infrastructure backbone, ports, highways, and refrigerated storage that could move produce from greenhouse to grocery shelf in record time. The rest funded education and training programs, creating a skilled workforce ready to dominate the next generation of farming. Analysts believe this was no coincidence. The same European companies that once relied on U.S. suppliers were now locking in long-term contracts with Mexican producers. American agriculture, slowed by regulation and political infighting, looked unpredictable. Mexico, on the other hand, looked fast, flexible, and hungry for growth. Within 8 months, premium Mexican tomatoes were already appearing on European shelves. Fresh, affordable, and backed by a new image of dependability. Prices ran nearly 25% lower than their American counterparts, and buyers didn't hesitate to switch. The message was clear. Mexico wasn't just filling a gap, it was taking over the stage. But south of the border's success came with a heavy price. As Mexico surged forward, small towns across California began to realize what that $12 billion investment really meant: the start of their own collapse. The fallout in America's heartland. Across California's farming belt, silence replaced the hum of harvest. Fields once alive with workers stood still, machines rusting under the sun. In towns like Watsonville and Delano, the collapse wasn't just economic, it was personal. Families who had farmed for generations suddenly faced a future without a market. For many, it felt like the land itself had turned against them. Processing plants that once ran 24 hours a day now sat in darkness. The parking lots were empty, save for a few trucks parked as silent reminders of busier times. Trucking firms that built their business hauling produce across the border cut their fleets in half. Repair shops closed. Fertilizer dealers vanished. Even the diners that kept night shift workers. Fed began shutting down one by one. Locals didn't call it a market correction, they called it ruin. Economists warned that this kind of collapse creates a ripple effect. For every dollar lost at the farm, 2 more disappear across the community. That prediction became reality almost overnight. In agricultural counties, unemployment spiked above 30%. Food processing lines ran at half capacity, and families who had held on through recessions and droughts were finally forced to walk away. Schools saw enrollment drop so sharply that entire programs vanished. Superintendents tried to stretch shrinking budgets, but every lost family meant fewer students, less funding, and more closures. The pain spread beyond classrooms. Rural hospitals already stretched thin, reduced hours, or shut down departments entirely. Medical debt rose as fast as property values fell, nearly 20% in just 6 months. Homes that once symbolized security were now reminders of debt no one could pay. And through it all, Washington stayed quiet. Hearings were held, statements made, but no one offered real help. In towns across the Central Valley, you could hear the same question again and again. How did this happen so fast? But the truth was already clear. While America hesitated, Mexico had moved. And as those border towns struggled to breathe, another blow was already on the horizon, one driven not by trade, but by technology. The technology divide and global consequences. As the dust settled, another truth emerged. America hadn't just lost a market, it had lost its edge. South of the border, Mexico's farms looked more like laboratories than fields. Rows of sensors monitored light, humidity, and nutrient flow in real time. Automated irrigation systems adjusted themselves without human input. Predictive models, powered by AI, calculated demand weeks ahead. While U.S. farmers waited for government relief, Mexico was fine-tuning a revolution. Reports suggest that European and Chinese tech firms led the charge, funneling their most advanced agricultural systems directly into Mexican operations. The results were staggering. Hydroponic farms in Sinaloa and Sonora produced higher yields with less than 2/3 the water used in California's Central Valley. Labor costs dropped by nearly half. Crops grew faster, lasted longer, and faced fewer losses from pests and weather. For every ton of tomatoes the U.S. produced, Mexico now produced more, and at a fraction of the cost. Meanwhile, in America, innovation stalled. Universities that once led the world in agricultural research were bogged down in funding cuts and red tape. Researchers complained that their work sat trapped in approval processes while foreign competitors raced ahead. Dr. Patricia Williams, a scientist who left California for Europe, described described the frustration plainly. We had the solutions on paper, they had them in the ground. That gap widened every season. U.S. infrastructure, processing plants, rail lines, and trucking networks was built for an era that no longer existed. With exports plummeting, the system became oversized and inefficient. Trucking companies that once thrived on cross-border routes reported losses of over 60%. Rail lines ran half empty, but maintenance costs stayed high. Every shipment that moved became more expensive, eroding what little competitiveness remained. Supermarkets didn't wait for politicians to act. Shelves that once proudly displayed California-grown produce quietly shifted to Mexican alternatives. Consumers cared about freshness and price, not national pride. And when Mexico offered both, the decision was easy. But the deeper danger wasn't just about tomatoes or trade. It was about what came next. Because if technology could tilt the balance this fast, the next wave might reshape the entire global food chain. Beyond tomatoes, a warning for the future. By the time Washington grasped the scale of the crisis, the damage was already spreading. The tomato collapse was no longer just a trade story. It had become a warning shot for the entire agricultural system. If a single crop could unravel so quickly, what would happen when wheat, soy, or corn faced the same pressure? Analysts believe the tomato ban exposed a vulnerability that had been building for decades, one rooted not in weather or soil, but in complacency. Food had turned into a form of power. The European Union, still wary after its reliance on Russian energy, was rethinking its entire supply chain strategy. Agriculture, once seen as simple trade, had become part of national security. And when Mexico stepped forward offering stable prices, year-round supply, and cutting-edge efficiency, Europe saw more than just a deal. It saw insurance. America, for the first time in generations, wasn't the safe bet. Back home, farmers were left asking questions that cut deep. How had the nation that fed the world lost control of its own food supply? Why were the same technologies that once began in US universities now flourishing elsewhere? Some reports suggest that bureaucratic stagnation and political infighting slowed adaptation, allowing competitors to leap ahead. Every hearing, every delay, every piece of red tape gave rivals more time to perfect their systems. Even consumers began to notice the shift. Supermarket prices climbed by more than 30%, and American produce, once a global symbol of quality, started to vanish from its own shelves. Meanwhile, Mexican tomatoes flooded international markets, celebrated for being cleaner, cheaper, and more consistent. Sustainability metrics favored them too. Less water, fewer emissions, more yield. The narrative had flipped completely. The tomato collapse wasn't just about lost revenue. It was about the erosion of trust, innovation, and leadership. The same factors that once made American agriculture unstoppable were now slowing it down. And as global competitors tighten their grip on food production, one haunting question remains. If one crop can bring an empire of farms to its knees, what happens when the rest start to fall? The beginning of a bigger collapse. The story of the tomato ban was never just about trade. It was a mirror reflecting how fragile America's agricultural dominance has become. One policy, one border decision, and decades of hard work unraveled almost overnight. Mexico didn't just fill the gap, it proved how quickly power shifts when innovation meets opportunity. The silence at the border wasn't the end of an industry, it was the sound of change echoing across nations. Analysts warn this is only the first crack in a much larger system. As technology, climate, and politics keep redrawing the global map, no country is safe from disruption. What began with tomatoes could easily spread to the crops that feed billions. Because when food becomes power, and power shifts hands, it's never just the farmers who pay the price, it's everyone who depends on what grows from their soil.